Today's learners live in an age of unforeseen challenges. Education can be a pathway for personal transformation, and it has the power to lead to the societal and global changes we need to build a just, sustainable, and peaceful future for all. But to do this, education itself has to transform, so everyone can learn the knowledge, skills, and values to care for each other and act for the planet. Welcome to the 5th UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health, and Well-being. A global discussion on where we stand on realizing transformative education. Together, we can build a better future.
Welcome to this plenary session. Welcome to all. A plenary session devoted to what does transformative education look like? What does progress on transformative education look like? For those who are familiar with the SDGs and with SDG 4 in particular, you'll know that when we're speaking about transformative education, we're essentially focusing on what we call target 4.7. And while the efforts around SDG 4 are largely around ensuring equitable access to quality education for all at all levels of education, 4.7 is really focusing on the question of relevance, the relevance of learning to our environment, to ourselves. It is really about the why of learning. Learning for our personal development, learning and the way we relate to others, so the social and civic dimensions of education, learning around how we relate to our natural environment, so what many would call education for sustainable development. In looking at that relevance of learning, the why of learning, it's obviously important to define also the what competencies, but also the how, what types of learning methods, what types of pedagogies, what types of learning environments foster, encourage the development of competencies that allow us to relate and engage with others and with our environment and ensure our own personal development in responsible ways. Obviously, and finally, monitoring our efforts and seeing if our efforts are going in the right direction, are producing the intended learning outcomes, is of importance, in particular for international and other regional organizations that are supporting education efforts
regionales.
So we're very pleased to have, I think there is some background, if you could kindly mute whoever is not muted. So very pleased to have our panel today to look at global and regional data on transformative education, and very pleased to have with us 3 panelists live and a 4th who will be joining us by video. So our first panelist, Miho Taguma from OECD. Welcome. Miho, you are the project manager at OECD for the Future of Education and Skills 2030. There has been work focusing on 21st century skills, as we know, in an initial phase, but then also looking at what it takes to foster and build these 21st century competencies, so looking at learning environments and perhaps at more system levels. So you will be talking to us in a minute about the OECD Learning Compass 2030, and how it relates to SDG 4. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. We also have Leanne Riley from the World Health Organization. Welcome. Leanne works at the Department for Non-Communicable Diseases, focused on surveillance of risk factors, and obviously looking closely also at education through surveys and a global school-based student health survey. Leanne, we look forward to you telling us a bit more about the WHO monitoring surveys to support school health transformation. Thank you very much for being with us. Next, we have Valeria Damiani. Welcome. Valeria is Associate Professor at LUMSA University in Rome. Has been involved in the IAE International Civic and Citizenship Education Studies since the second cycle in 2016, and involved now in the third cycle underway. And we look forward to hearing from you on assessing global citizenship education and education for sustainable school education, and some insights from the international civic and citizenship. And our fourth participant who will be coming in for video is our colleague Henríquez Calderon, who is the coordinator of the Latin American Laboratory for Assessment of the Quality of Education. And he will be presenting the results of the curricular analysis that was conducted as part of the 2019 cycle comparative and exploratory regional study looking at learning outcomes and follow-up curricular elements in participating countries. Just a word about how we will organize this session. We'll go first from each of our panelists, 15 minutes maximum to hear each of you providing insights from the global or regional perspective. Then we will have some time for Valeria to for panel discussion. I'll be proposing a number of questions to you, at least the three people who are connected live. And if we have some time at the end, we'd also like to take a couple of questions from the audience. So I encourage all of you who are to add your comments and questions in the chat. At the end of the session, I'll be turning to my colleague Allison. Questions. So with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor now to Miho, Taguma, to present the work, introduce us to the OECD, that's released in SDG target 4.7. Miho, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Sobhi. Hello, everybody. My name is Miho Taguma, and thank you very much for this opportunity to share with you what OECD has been doing in relation to the SDG 4.7. So next, please. So today, once again, next, please. Thank you. So with such a limited time, but I would like to focus on two aspects of our project, which is really big because we started back in 2015. So you will get to hear only the surface of our work. But first, I would like to share with you a very, very brief background of our project, OECD Future of Education 2030. And also, I would like to introduce only 3 aspects of our learning compass, because those are relevant for 4.7 as Sobhi set out just now. One is the concept of competencies, and we visit the concept, this holistic approach. And second, just as Sobhi said, how do we really embed that into curriculum that has implications for not only policymakers, but also the teachers in the classroom, and also how to measure such competencies. So those will be my focus today. Next, please. And very briefly about our project. As I said, it started back in 2015. And for the first phase, we have been looking at the what questions. What kinds of competencies that includes knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values will today students need to thrive and shape a better future, not just any future, but a better future. But at the OECD, the whole global community defined the better future is to ensure well-being of individuals and of others as well, not only self, and also planetary well-being. So we take a holistic approach to define well-being. And as a result of this, we produced, click please, our learning compass. So this compass has a lot of concepts and answers to these what questions. And currently, we are focusing on click please. The question is shifted from what to how. So our project is investigating the questions such as how to design the learning environment where students can actually thrive and shape a better future, and how to effectively implement the curriculum, which is future-oriented, and how to develop teacher agency, just as student agency is important for the learning compass. And therefore, click please, we are currently co-creating with the whole global community the OECD teaching compass, and you are most welcome to join this global effort. Next, please. And next, so as I said, what about this competencies? Yes, you can click, thank you. So we really placed a concept of student agency at the heart of this learning compass, because students themselves need to navigate themselves through the uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity towards the well-being of 2030. And also students learn and develop their agency, not alone, but in interactions with others that includes peers, friends, teachers, parents, siblings, or even pets at home, or any others in the community that they belong to. Every student is learning everywhere, every time. So we really highlight the concept of the quality of interactions as co-agency. And also students are learning in dynamics of a group that may be heterogeneous or homogeneous. And this collective agency is important. And we, even as adults, is tested today to cope with this COVID situation as collective agency, as a society, or as a nation. Next, please. And also we take a holistic approach to define competency, because oftentimes, I'm sure all of you have heard about the false dichotomy of knowledge versus skills, or competencies versus knowledge. However, the competency is a holistic concept, so that includes not only knowledge, but also skills and also attitudes and values. Next, please. And this is just one example of a school from Denmark, and how even a school is trying to develop not only knowledge, but also skills and also values. And this is captured as a learning cycle and learning wheel, and as a concept to enhance qualities of a learner. Next, please. And here I would like to compare and contrast our learning compass with 4.7, the goal. And you can see 4.7 includes only knowledge and skills in writing, but we assume that attitudes and values are inherently embedded in 4.7 because all of the values highlighted in blue actually are really rooted in attitudes and values, including education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, promoting a culture of peace. All of these really requires the right attitudes and values. Next, please. And if we try to ask ourselves, what do we monitor and which progress do we monitor? There are so many different ways forward. So if we look at what's been described in 4.7, 1 to 5, we can see all of these thematic progress is highlighted in blue just now we saw, but the instruments to monitor these can be highlighted in two different ways. One is I highlighted in red. Those are the efforts such as education policy, curricula, teacher education, student assessment, schools and frameworks. These are the instruments to monitor institutions or the efforts to promote this. Whereas the highlighted in orange or yellowish orange, this is really monitoring the actual student outcomes or achievement. So adequate understanding of the students about global citizenship and sustainability, and also actual proficiency in knowledge in environmental science and geoscience. So out of these different instruments and different aspects, I would like to share with you today from OECD the various monitoring tools, but specifically for global competency and sustainable development as examples. Next, please. So out of all of these thematic, the highlighted in blue are the themes like gender equality or human rights. OECD's Learning Compass really created a meta-level concept where students need as transformative competencies for them to thrive in a world of uncertainty and complexity and shape a better future. So those transformative competencies include one, creating new value, because the societies have a lot of issues and problems, and students need to find new ways to solve problems, which unfortunately our generation might have failed to find yet. So adults can work with the new generation to find new solutions to the problems we are facing. But not all innovations are good to humankind or environments. So innovations requires a lot of reflective thinking, and therefore another competencies students need is taking responsibility and making informed decisions. And in any of the innovations, there are always tensions and dilemmas, and oftentimes contradictions and trade-offs and ambiguities. And we are, as adults, once again, we are facing this complexity in coping with the COVID. So reconciling these tensions and dilemmas is very important as part of the transformative competencies. And we can see many of the jurisdictions and countries are embedding these competencies in their national curriculum. Next, please. So we are going to see how countries embed these into curriculum. Next, please. So one example is from British Columbia, Canada, and their approach is, one is to set the student profile, vision of the students, what kind of competencies that this jurisdiction would like to foster through a curriculum. So one example is their vision of educated citizen includes one competency, which is aware of the rights and prepared to exercise the responsibilities of an individual within the family, the community, Canada, and the world. So this already includes the global citizenship and also the responsibilities as well. Next, please. And this is another example from Canada, but Quebec. And here, one example includes environmental awareness and consumer rights and responsibility. That really is directly linked to the environmental literacy, the literacy for sustainable development, inclusive. Next, please. And this is another way how countries embed those 4.7 type of goals into curriculum. One is, just as I shared with you, the vision, but next is at the subject level. So this is an example of how different countries embed global competencies as a main or sub-target of a learning area. And you can see many countries embed global competency to a different degree into their curriculum. And what is interesting is countries make different choices about how to embed them in different learning areas. Some of them embed them in national languages more than others. Others embed them more in humanities, and others embed them more in the home economics, for example. So it is okay for each individual jurisdiction to decide how to embed, but we can see increasingly many countries are embedding those into subject because this is to really avoid curriculum overload. If you try to add all of these 4.7 goals into a curriculum as a subject, then students are stretching themselves too thinly to learn so many different themes. It is very important to embed them into existing curriculum to avoid curriculum overload. Another example is the literacy for development, the sustainable development. Next, please. And here again, you can see many countries are embedding into subject-specific curriculum, but once again, you can see different countries make different choices into which learning area the literacy for sustainable development is embedded. Next, please. So finally, it is still easier to embed them into curriculum. What is really difficult is how to measure such competencies. Next, please. So one example from OECD is about PISA, the measurement of global competence. And as I said, there are different components of a competency: knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. Depending on which aspect of the competency, how we can measure varies. So for example, even within PISA, knowledge and cognitive skills were directly tested, whereas social and emotional skills and attitudes are surveyed through self-report. And of course, this decreases the question of validity and reliability because it is a self-report. It can be quite subjective. So we are currently experiencing some instruments to measure social emotional skills. And next, please. And this is just to show you and how the PISA literacy and global competency matches or not. And click, please. So on the right side, you see the scores and the countries, and left is the global competency. Click, please. So Canada literacy score is high, and on the global competency is high too. Click, please. However, the Colombia is not as high as the Canada, but on the global competency, they scored really high. So there is no direct relationship between the literacy, basic literacy, and global competency. Next, please. And this is to show how attitudes and values can predict performance. And some of the attitudes and values, such as respect for other countries, has a higher correlation than just having an awareness of intercultural communication. Next, please. And this is to show how young people care about climate change, but they feel unable to make a difference. So on the right, left side, and right side. So implication for this is really coming back to the agency. Again, it's not enough that the young people care about, but they really need to take actions. Next, please. And therefore, in our learning compass, we highlight and how action is very important and reflect from action and anticipate for the future. This cycle is very important. And next, please, the final slide. And this really leaves us some food for thought. So students are starting to take action for the climate. However, the actions vary. And students really need to not only be aware, but take actions, but different types of actions, because different, small or big, taking an action will make a difference. But how to measure it? This is still a self-report. We do need more objective instruments to monitor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miho. I hope my sound is better. I was told that it was breaking up before. Apologies for that. So good. I see everyone nodding and smiling, so that's good. Thank you very much, Miho. That was very insightful. Just a couple of points that I think were important. I mean, on the concept of competencies that you started with, and that you ended with, the centrality of student agency, co-agency and collective agency, and interesting what you were saying about caring, according to recent results, students and young people caring about the climate, but not necessarily feeling capacitated to do something about it. So the question of agency. On that note, we often speak about students and young people as the citizens of tomorrow. I think vis-a-vis climate change, and we're seeing that increasingly, it's the citizens of today, and in many places acting in reaction actually to our generation's insufficient action or inaction. But on competencies, I also found interesting that it is understood very broadly, so encompassing knowledge, understanding, skills, values, and attitudes, and that there is no need to oppose artificially competencies with skills, knowledge, and whatever. But interestingly, and you pointed that out, the formulation of Target 4.7 does speak of knowledge and skills, and it would make sense to be thinking in broader terms around competencies. Interesting also on the transformative competencies and the global competence, the literacy around sustainable development, and different ways that these are being embedded in curricula. And we know from and this is shown in the results that you presented, that increasingly it's efforts to embed in existing subjects or learning areas, and to avoid this competition to be including so much from different partners' agendas into curricula, and to avoid curricular overload. Thank you very much for that. I think that was an excellent introduction to the panel. And I'd now like to move on to Leanne from the World Health Organization, and a presentation on the WHO monitoring surveys to support school health transformation. Leanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's really my pleasure to follow such a informative presentation. I think it's highly complimentary. So next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit then about the systems that we've set up, which are more health focused, to try and look at that landscape of information for monitoring global and regional data. So if I could have my next slide, please. And I think we're sort of pivoting from this very broad sense around competency and agency to really focusing in a little bit on some of the health-related behaviour. So I just wanted to acknowledge and share this slide that actually came from my colleagues in UNESCO. If you could just click forward twice, I think it will bring up to the slides. Just 2 clicks, please. just showing this landscape of what's out there. And as you can see, when you really look at this, there's been a lot of progression in the last decade or two to really try and bring about some of these monitoring and surveillance initiatives. And below the line, it's really showing the topic-specific monitoring initiatives to bring in data, some of which I've actually been responsible for. There's the Global Youth Tobacco Survey that was done in around 2000. And then above the line, it's looking more at integrated or more comprehensive, capturing a range of topics here. And so I'm really pleased to be focusing a little bit on a couple of those initiatives that we've led at WHO, but with a huge partnership. I really do want to acknowledge that, with a whole lot of agencies to really try and bring about some efforts to capture data around student health behaviour. So two of those initiatives I'm going to talk about. One that appears in this histogram just after 2000, which is the global GSHS, the Global School-Based Student Health Survey. And then about a decade later, the Global School Health Policies and Practices Surveys. But really just to acknowledge, and it's so nice to see that there's this swell of new initiatives around monitoring. So if I could have the next slide, please. I'd really like to then focus in this presentation on, as I mentioned, two of those initiatives. Very central to our work, though, has been the establishment and then maintenance of this Global School-Based Student Health Survey. So we started, when we actually started looking at this in around the late 90s, and I'm embarrassed to say I was still at WHO then and leading this work, so that really does age me, doesn't it? But we started out looking at what information is available in and out of school to really help understand the behaviour of young people that can really be used to transform health planning and health service planning and prioritisation for the topics that we should be capturing with young people. And there really, other than in some high-income countries, was almost nothing. So in this partnership with agencies, we then established this surveillance system for monitoring behavioural risk factors and protective factors in school-aged children. And the intention was really to come up with something that could be standardised so that over time it could monitor changes in those behaviours, but also do some comparison within and across countries. So next slide, please. So just a little bit then around the methods for GSHS, and these have largely not changed since its introduction back in the very beginning of 2000. So it's a self-administered survey, and we target students in the age range of 13 to 17. So we're looking at school-going adolescents, and the intention is that they do it during their one classroom period. It's anonymous and confidential, so we're not interested in knowing who's answered, just how they've answered. We want students to try and tell us as honestly as they can about what they know and what they do. And then we have 10 topics of these health behaviours and protective factors that we're really monitoring. And these are the 10. These 10 areas correspond to the kind of main drivers for morbidity and mortality in young people. So we look at the traditional kind of risk factor approaches: alcohol, diet. We measure height and weight. So we have BMI for things like underweight, overweight and obesity. We look at drug use, hygiene, which has of course become particularly important in a global pandemic. So asking around hand washing and sanitation. Mental health, again, absolutely critical in the current environment. Physical activity patterns, but we also look at what we call here protective factors, and that I think relates back a little bit to some of Miho's presentation. We're looking at autonomy, regulation, and a sense of connection to their community and family. We look at sexual behaviours, tobacco use, and violence and injury. So they're all kind of important topics in the context of that young person's behaviour in their life. And what's of course very critical for this survey is that we're looking at all of those behaviors in connection with each other. So we can, you know, we also run some topic-specific ones, but I really feel that these comprehensive approaches tell us a little bit about the connectedness of these issues across a young person's life as well, so very helpful. Now, the next slide, please. I'm really not expecting you to absorb this and the next slide, but just to show some of the key behavioural indicators that come out of this survey across those topics of use. So here are the ones listed for alcohol use, dietary behaviours, drug use, hygiene, mental health and physical activity. And then the next slide, please, just lists what some of those issues might be, or the key behaviours or behavioural indicators. And these are expressed as a percentage of the students for these other topics: protective factors, which I mentioned, sexual behaviour, HIV-related knowledge in countries where it's difficult to ask around the sexual behaviour, tobacco use, and then of course violence and unintended injury. So that's to give you a sense of what the surveys can actually capture. The next couple of slides, so just if you would click forward to one more, shows some selected results. So next slide, please. We have a little bit around mental, I've given 3 examples in the coming slides. So we've got mental health, and then this is showing, because we now have so many countries who've done this, what the regional median percentage would be, and then the range within the countries within those regions. So just, again, this is probably too much information to absorb, but I wanted to give you a sense of the kind of data that comes out. Of course, from our perspective, the country-specific data is what is very critical for policy and programming, but this just gives you a sense of some of the results. So this is a slide looking at mental health and some of the key indicators there. Next slide, please. We're looking at some of the data around dietary behaviour, but also, as I mentioned, we're weighing and measuring the students, so we know from objective measurement who's underweight and who may be overweight and who's obese. And then my last slide in these particular ones focuses on physical activity behaviour and looks at the students who are meeting the guidelines for being physically active, but also looking at their sedentary behaviour. And again, these are just presenting the region median percentage and then what the range would be across those countries. Next slide, please. The way we've developed the system, as I mentioned, it's a common methodology that we use across all countries, but WHO and partners have been providing quite a lot of capacity building and support for the implementation of these surveys in countries over the last 2 decades. So we really start with support around planning, thinking about sampling, questionnaire development, survey administration, and then countries implement the surveys, and we follow that up with support around data analysis and reporting, building some capacity for data analysis. And then very critically, there's work done to look at how the data is applied, because the whole point of collecting this data is to make a change with policy and programmatic work. And we're not just collecting this information really for the sake of it. We want something to be done around health-related policy and programming in this for this age group, and it's also a useful device to track whether the interventions that are being implemented are actually having an impact. So that's the whole kind of cycle that we see moving forward. So just a sense then of current implementation. So worldwide, we've had 112 countries across all of our WHO regions who've implemented at least one round of GSHS. We have 47 countries who've done repeat surveys, and some who've done it multiple times now. So we're really starting to kind of grow that effort, and that's very encouraging. My next slide then, I'd like to just talk about a complementary initiative that about a decade into the GSHS work, we were asked by partners to really think about, we're doing so much work to assess the student health behaviour. Could we also look at the environment in which they're, in which they're learning, and how does that support health-related work as well. And so we developed this complementary, but it also can be independent, surveillance system that monitors school-level health policy and practices. And so the intention of this is to come up with credible information at the school level. So I just want to clarify that, because very often there's a lot of policy implementation at the national level, and this is really looking at what happens then at school level. Are those policies being applied, or what is the environment in which those students are then absorbing this? So very similarly to the model that we had for GSHS, the idea is to help get data that's representative of schools in a country to really think about what kind of policies, priorities and programs would be available in a comparative way. So if I could have the next slide, please, just a little bit about methods then for this survey. Next slide, please. This is unlike the GSHS, which is targeting the age range 13 to 17. So we're really in secondary school. For this survey, we're looking at all schools in the country. So it's primary and secondary. So the survey is done in a sample of primary and secondary schools. And in this survey, we're looking at 8 areas of assessment. So some school basic demographic information about schools. Are they boarding schools, are it boys and girls, etc. And then questions that relate to the health services, the physical environment, the food and nutrition services that are provided, the teaching, the curricula that's being taught related to health, physical education, and then the governance and leadership that exists at the school, and finally the policies and resources. Next slide, please. I should just say that that survey, it's newer, and we're kind of transitioning a little bit for that at the moment. So my final slide, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on how far we've come over these last 2 decades, and really where we still see some challenges. So we're very proud of the fact that there's been very wide uptake of the Global School-Based Student Health Survey, GSHS. So it really highlights to us that there is high demand to have good quality comparable data that can be reviewed over time. So that's very good. We think there's real engagement there. And we're really happy with the efforts to make sure that there's good alignment across questionnaires to try and harmonise indicators from other systems, like the health behaviour of school-aged children, for example, which is very European oriented. And then efforts now to look at through, for example, GAMMA, what are the indicators for monitoring adolescent health, and taking questions and indicators that have come out of GSHS, really driving that. We've also established reasonably good review processes to make sure that the measures and topics that we came up with 2 decades ago are still the relevant topics that we should be monitoring in the health behaviour of these students. And we've had emerging topics. So back in 2000 or 1999, when we were developing this, there wasn't the same online presence for young people. So we were focused, we've always had questions around bullying, but I think it focused very much on like in person. And we've really seen this rise in cyberbullying. So in relationship to that with partners, particularly UNESCO, really pushing to make sure that we adapt the questions and to the current context for young people. As I mentioned, we've had this complementary development to track school health policy and practice, and that's been really encouraging, but we need better uptake of that, and we're looking at methods to do that at the moment, moving to online digital platform for the health policy and practices survey. And very recently, we've had a really good alignment and review for the health policy and practices survey to reflect and track the implementation of the new global standards for health promoting schools. So that's a really encouraging alignment. We have some challenges, that is for sure. And of course, our most pressing one has been in relation to the current global pandemic for COVID. We've seen a lot of school closure. And so, of course, for our methods for GSHS, there really is still, it's an in-person, it's a self-administered questionnaire that's done in school. So if school is not operating or is only operating in an online environment, that's really challenging. We've looked into digital methods, but there's a real equity and access issue for many of the students that we are focused on at WHO in low and middle income countries. So that remains a challenge. Some other challenges are we would like to really transition towards more autonomy in the countries to implement the surveys with perhaps less technical backstopping from WHO. So building capacity so that they're capable of doing that as they move forward is also something. And then finally, sustainability for these systems without external funding is, obviously our goal. So those were just some final reflections on these systems. And thank you very much. Last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leanne, for sharing this experience over 2 decades, perhaps, on the global school-based student health survey. Interesting to see how, beyond looking at learning outcomes, also interested in looking at what are the supportive, factors and the school level environment. So looking also at school health policies and practices. A little similarly to what we heard earlier, also from Miho, in looking at, first looking at competencies and monitoring learning outcomes, but then to look also at factors related to policy, school level management, leadership, teacher training, assessment, and other factors. On COVID, you're absolutely right. I mean, beyond the direct risk to health, beyond the educational disruption that school closures have caused, an incidence also on how we monitor progress, on how we research in all areas, and maybe for another discussion, implications there for what we consider data and evidence and ways that we collect this. But that's for another discussion. I think what, in focusing on health-related behaviors, I mean, we recall again that a broad understanding of competencies being the specific information, knowledge, understanding, skills, values, attitudes, ultimately to create or to lead to certain behaviors. In this case, safe, lower risk, healthy behaviors. But ultimately, all our efforts in 4.7 are looking at some sort of learning outcome. As I tried to say when perhaps the sound was breaking up at the very beginning, it really is, SDG 4.7 is really the why question. Ultimately, what behavioral outcomes, what social outcomes do we want from learning? In terms of personal development, in terms of personal health, in terms of how we relate to others and how we relate to the environment. And so with this, we now will be focusing with Valeria, Damiani, on global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, what we can learn about that, through the experience of the International Civic and Citizenship Education Studies, currently the 3rd one underway. Valeria, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Really glad to be here and to share with you the results. I mean, how we dealt with the assessment of global citizenship education and education for sustainable development within the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study. Next, please. This presentation was prepared together with Julian Freylon from the Australian Council for Educational Research. Next, please. And it is focused on the assessment of GCED and ECD within a study that is primarily focused on civic and citizenship education. I will start with a very quick overview of the IEA studies on civic and citizenship education, and then I will present the second round of the study, ICCS 2016, and highlight how we dealt with the transition from ICCS 2016 to ICCS 2022. I will then briefly present some results of the second cycle in ICCS 2016 and a quick insight into the next round. And the final section is related to challenges and opportunities. Next, please. So the IEA studies on civic and citizenship education date back to 1971, when the first IEA civic education study was carried out. The second study promoted by the IEA on civic education, known as CIVED, was carried out in 1999. But it is with the ICCS first cycle in 2009 that the concept of civic education has been broadened. In fact, in the study, we adopted the term civic and citizenship education, highlighting the fact that the study measures not only students' civic knowledge, understanding, and engagement, but also the wide range of ways people used to interact and to shape their communities and society. So after the first round of ICCS in 2009, we had a second round in 2016, and an upcoming round is foreseen in 2022. Next, please. So ICCS aims at investigating the ways in which students are prepared to become citizens. It assesses lower secondary students' civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement, and it allows to monitor trends over time. ICCS addresses persisting and new challenges of educating young people, with these including the new content of CCE curricula related to the perceptions of changes occurring in society. This is very important because, as we will see, this is of course strongly related to the inclusion of global citizenship education and education for sustainable development within the assessment framework of the study. Next, please. So in ICCS 2016, 8th grade students, which is the target population of the study, civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement are measured in the context of globalization, social cohesion, interaction, democracy, communication technology, environmental sustainability, and the global financial crisis. Next, please. Civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement are relevant aspects related to the development of the individual's role in society, the interconnections with the civic systems, the development of moral attitudes, and their social and political participation. So in a very transformative way. Next, please. ICCS encompasses different instruments: an international cognitive test, an international student questionnaires, two contextual questionnaires, a teacher and school questionnaire, and two regional student questionnaires relating to region-specific issues. So in ICCS 2016, we had the European and the Latin American regional questionnaires. More than 90,000 students took part in the survey, and 37,000 teachers were involved in almost 4,000 schools. Next, please. 24 countries participated in the second round of ICCS, 16 European countries, 3 countries in Asia, and 5 from Latin America. The one highlighted in bold are the countries that took part in both the first and second cycle of ICCS. Next, please. So what about global citizenship education and education for sustainable development in the study? In the first and second IEA studies on civic education, several international issues were included: foreign affairs, international organization, social cohesion and diversity, student interest in social problems at national and international level. But it is only with ICCS that the global dimension gained more relevance. So we shifted from civic education beyond the national border, which characterized the first and the second IEA civic education studies, to a broadened scope of civic and citizenship education in the view of global perspectives and interconnectedness. And this, of course, led to the inclusion of global citizenship education and education for sustainable development gradually across the different cycles of the study. Next, please. So we start with ICCS 2009, where we include the sustainable development as a key concept in the assessment framework. Then in 2016, environmental sustainability was a new focus area in the framework, and we included also global citizenship as a key concept. But it is only with the next cycle of ICCS in 2022, where global citizenship education and education for sustainable development gain greater recognition as independent and focus areas of the study. This is also due to the fact that they were adopted into the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Next, please. So how we dealt with the transition from ICCS 2016 to 2022. We already had some contents related to ESD and GSD in 2016. So our first task was to define the scope of these areas for consideration by ICCS 2022. Then we needed to map existing ESD and GSD content against ICCS content, and to decide which were the existing commonalities and if there was any missing content. Next, please. So this is the result of our mapping of GSD and DSD content into the ICCS framework. As you can see, most of the items were explicitly mentioned. The one in red and the one in green were in scope of the study, and so they were also included in the framework. Next, please. So the ICCS solution adopted for the 2022 round is to consider GCD as an overarching area that is relevant to all the aspects already included in ICCS. Sustainable development is considered as a specific content subdomain, and new items have been developed to address a wide range of GCD and DSD related attitudes, behavior, and knowledge. And additional questions were included into the contextual questionnaire to assess the school and classroom context for GCD and DSD. Next, please. So I will briefly present some findings relating to GCD and DSD in ICCS 2016. Next, please. This is an example of a cognitive item relating to medical care right. More than 80% of the students on average who participated in the study answered correctly to this question, and we found the highest percentage of correct responses in Norway and the lowest in the Dominican Republic. Next, please. This is another example of a cognitive item. 57% of the students answered correctly to this question, which is related to argument against the protecting business. In Denmark, we found the highest percentages of correct responses, while in Peru, the lowest. Next, please. This is another example of a question included in International Student Questionnaire related to student perception of environmental related issues considered as global threats. As you can see, 76% of the students consider pollution as the major global threat, followed by terrorism, water shortages, food shortages, infectious disease. It has to be pointed out that this question was administered in 2016, so probably the results today would be quite different, especially in relation to infectious disease. 49% of the students viewed that making personal efforts to protect the environment is a very important part of good citizenship. Next, please. While only 9% of students reported that they had participated in an environmental action group over the past 12 months. The graph here in the slides presents the result of a question included in the school questionnaires about the environmentally friendly practices adopted by principals in schools. So as you can see, 80% of the principals reported to use, to a large or to a moderate extent, on average, of course, energy-saving practices, followed by posters to encourage students' environmentally friendly behaviors and differential waste collection. Next, please. The last example is a question included in the teacher questionnaire, asking teachers about their activities with students on environmental issues. On average, teachers reported to conduct activities making students aware of the environmental impact of excessive water and energy consumption, followed by activities on recycling and waste collection in the local community. Next, please. And this is a very quick glimpse into the new cycle of ICCS 2022 for what concerns GCED and ESD. The cognitive test will include new additional items on this area related to issues such as ethical consumerism, migration, environmental protection, globalization. The student questionnaire will include questions already present in ICCS 2016, for example, the one on the perceptions of global threats, but also additional new questions related to attitudes toward environmental protection, perception of good citizenship with the subdomain related to global citizenship education, and in the European Student Regional Questionnaire, a question on students reporting on their sustainable behaviors. The contextual questionnaires, school and teachers questionnaire, will include questions on the activities carried out at school and classroom level in order to promote and to raise students' awareness on global issues and on interconnectedness at local and global level. And in addition to this, the teacher questionnaire will encompass questions on teachers' preparedness on GCED and ESD topics and their opportunities to be trained on this area. Of course, all of these questions are self-reported. Next, please. In this final slide, I will present some closing thoughts. Since most of ESD GCED content can be referenced or implied within ICCS, we face several challenges in the assessment of this area. The first challenge is related to the need to clarify the definition and the scope of GCED and ESD within a study that is primarily focused on civic and citizenship education. So to analyze how these three areas interact with each other. The second challenge is related in the allocation of content across domain, especially for the content within the scope of GCED and ESD that is presented in a local context. And lastly, the possible difficulties related in identifying different subscales in relation to students' knowledge in these three areas. On the other hand, the emphasis of GCED and ECD outcomes in civic and citizenship education offers an unique opportunity to measure students' knowledge, attitudes, and engagement in these three areas, and to gather data on what really happens in schools. We know that from a theoretical perspective, it is quite difficult to set boundaries between these three areas, but this is much more difficult in school realities, where these three areas are highly overlapped in teacher practices and in learning processes. Finally, analyzing GCED and ECD outcomes within a framework of civic and citizenship education allows us to define and clarify shared global understanding and priorities, gathering benchmarking data in these areas. Next slide, please. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for that presentation. You packed in a lot but very clear and very useful. Interesting to see the transition or the evolution between the 2000 well, over time, but also the ICCS 2016 to 2019, moving from increasingly moving towards understandings of citizenship that incorporate the global dimension, issues around our interconnectedness and our interdependencies, and interesting to know what new items come in each round, reflecting you know, our evolving realities and the realities of students and young people. On the I found interesting also on the mapping exercise that was done, mapping of the content on ESD and GCED, that there is overlap, and this we know in all of these areas that are you know, aiming to promote a range of behavioral outcomes, that while there might be specific areas of information, knowledge, understandings, there would tend to be also some commonality in the types of skills, values and attitudes, regardless of the domain of manifestation of the behavior, whether that's in relation to others, to our own well-being, or to the environment. And then on the challenges, definitely the definitional challenge, which is always there in terms of what really is encompassed under global citizenship education, and how does that relate to education for sustainable development, and then in the case of the IEA, how that relates to what has been and has evolved over time around understandings of citizenship education. So thank you very much for that. We have a last presentation, which will be looking also at global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, based on an analysis of curricula. And again, the issue of content and how that is introduced, how it is defined in order to identify it, and how it is introduced. So this is a video from our colleague Carlos Henríquez Calderon, who is the coordinator of the LLECE, the Latin American Laboratory for Assessment of the Quality of Education at the UNESCO Regional Bureau in Santiago. The video is in Spanish, so please use the interpretation function. And I kindly ask the support team to launch the video.
Un saludo a todas y a todas.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me at the 5th UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health and Well-being. I would like to say hi on behalf of UNESCO Santiago office, and thank you very much for having me today. And let me tell you that we will join your efforts at LLECE. And with this presentation, first I would like to say that LLECE collects evidence, and that is our objective. And we collect data from 18 countries. And in fact, we collect information about basic education, including reading and math and so on. And at the same time, we have 2030 agenda as a top priority with a focus on the target 4.7. And we want to provide that perspective to the citizens and students. And we want to create and co-build a community together to improve the quality of life. And we collected data from 18 countries, and we compared data. And in a few hours, we will be releasing the outcome of the data. And on December 16th, we will release a module on the social and emotional skills. And we hope to contribute to the 4.7 target. At the same time, we need to really think about how we can improve the skills of the students to attain 4.7 and go beyond just reading and writing and math and science skills. And the study that I will share today is a contextualized and comprehensive evaluation. And it was jointly conducted with other countries, and we looked at the curriculums of different countries, and we would like to identify what the curriculums have in common across the different countries and identify the trends and some differences and challenges of education in respective countries. And with this vast research, at the end of 2019, we actually analyzed different materials and different curriculum. For instance, language and math and science. And while we analyzed the different documents, we also looked at how much the curriculum reflected the 2030 agenda. And at the same time, we looked at whether the curriculum reflected the GCE, Global Citizenship Education, and Sustainable Development. So these are what we did. And also, we looked at the different concepts, including global citizenship, education, and sustainable development. We looked at the content, the values, and the skills. And number 3, we also looked at the reading and math and science, the 3 subjects that are analyzed by ERCE 2019 report, and we looked at 3rd grade and 6th grade and whether the principles were well applied when developing curriculums for 3rd grades and 6th grades. And we also looked at the meta concepts of the different materials. And as you can see here, with respect to GCED, we had 5 pillars: rights, participation, community, and democracy, which were part of the first pillar, citizens. Also, it talks about education for peace, tolerance, non-discrimination, respect, and dialogue. And then we have globalization and diversity, and at the same time, we have critical thinking, creativity, and skills. And for gender equality, it included the basic elements of 2030 agenda. And then for sustainable development, we had environment, skills, climate change, and action. And under environment, there were ideas that we need to reduce pollution. And this is the preliminary analysis of what I just said. We took 2 different approaches, and this is the methodology that we used. First, there was this declarative level, which includes and embodies the mission and vision of the schools. And it also provides explanation about how we can achieve the goal. So it's about the tools. And then we have the program level, which is about how we design the curriculum and whether the documents clearly define and present the educational goals. And this is a 1-pager that shows the summary of the content. And some elements were included in both declarative and program levels, and some were in just program levels and others on declarative levels, and some were in neither levels. Knowledge about the world, or empathy and happiness, and concepts like these were some of the concepts that need to be further developed. And we can learn that from this
result. And if we dive deeper into the concepts such as respect, citizens, diversity, identity emerge quite often. However, concepts such as fraternity and happiness do not come out that easy. And we also have gender equality, which was highlighted in so many countries. However, despite such efforts, gender equality needs to be improved. And as for sustainable development, it has 18 concepts, but 8 of them are only reflected in about 60% of the nation's curriculum. And as for environment and sustainability, concepts regarding these two were reflected across all different nations. So this is the graph of what I just mentioned. So X-axis is declarative level, Y-axis is the program level. So when we develop curriculum, we have to take the concepts to the next level, which means that when it comes to ideas and concepts like carbon and green economy, we need to further develop those concepts in our region. I need to now wrap up. If you need more information, please visit our website at www.UNESCO.org, and we are doing our best to provide the English version of the result of the research. I do not think that the school's curriculum exactly illustrate the educational method of the teachers. It's not easy to understand what's actually being delivered with the education by only looking at the curriculum itself. However, curriculums serve as a benchmark to know more about whether specific topics are being taught or not. And in that context, GCED, as well as the sustainable development, are much reflected in the declarative level, but not at the program level. But it should be included at the program level so that we provide and teach such concepts to the students. And I wasn't able to see concepts such as education, sustainable development, especially when it came to carbon and economy. So we need to reflect those, and this is something that the region should be looking at. At the same time, we also need to look at the concept of sense of belonging or community or one, mankind, and so forth, because that is key to our survival and democracy. At the same time, fraternity, solidarity, and peaceful conflict resolution should also be some of the concepts that should go beyond declarative level and be embraced at the program level and be taught in the classrooms. And I would like to thank GIS Lab for their participation. We hope to continue on with our research on basic education, and we need to work further to take a holistic approach. And in that approach, we need to work with the teachers, but that's just the starting point. Also, we need to make sure to open a platform for discussion for transformative education for global citizenship education and sustainable development. I hope that the efforts of the 18 countries in LEC and Caribbean region contribute to the transformative education of UNESCO. And I'm sure that you are also contributing to transformative education. And I hope that this forum will serve as an opportunity to learn from one another. And I will now share our report, and as I said, we are doing our best to provide the English version of the report, and we ask for your participation, and I hope that we can contribute to opening a new era for the children by contributing to transformative education. Thank you very much for having me, and we hope to continue on with our efforts going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Carlos Henríquez Calderon, not with us, but through video. We see the challenges, I think, in looking at, in conducting curricular analysis across 18 countries, looking at 3rd, 6th grade, and looking at curricular content with regard to global citizenship education and education for sustainable development. And we've seen across, I think, the various experiences. I mean, you know, the initial definitional challenge and what kind of meta concepts are used. And there would be, you know, room for debate there. But I think extremely interesting here to see an attempt at regionalizing and contextualizing that to the Latin American and Caribbean region. So it's also, and I think perhaps Valeria, you had mentioned that, it's also about localizing and contextualizing these global issues. How do they play out? How are they understood? How are they perceived? And how are they then approached in education? So thank you to all of you. We've got just a little bit of time. I know there was one question in the chat, and I know that there was a response to it, but I think useful to bring up just quickly publicly, because it also relates to the health-related outcomes. And it was a question about, for the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, whether there is or there can be integration of global health awareness. Valeria, if you just want to say a word, and Leanne, feel free to, if you would like to add to that. Otherwise, I've got questions for all of you. But maybe on that first, Valeria.
Yes, we don't have a specific focus on global health awareness, but we have several items related to the pandemic and in infectious diseases in the student questionnaire.
Okay, thanks for that, Valeria. Miho, on from the perspective of OECD work, whether in PISA or beyond, just maybe a word on perhaps health-related aspects, components of competencies.
Yes, thank you for the relevant question, because when Leanne from WHO were presenting, I felt, it's a pity that I didn't have time and I didn't cover the area about well-being, because OECD has produced the well-being framework as well for the children. And also in PISA, we have the well-being framework as well. So it is becoming more and more mainstreamed in many aspects of our learning compass as well. And before the transformative competencies, we included core foundations, and not core foundations. When we hear about core foundations, curriculum people immediately think about literacy and numeracy. However, the core foundations today includes not only literacy and numeracy, but well-being, which includes health, but that health includes the mental and physical. And this is really embedded in our core foundation, and also socio-emotional foundations as well. So core foundations of learning no longer is limited to literacy and numeracy, but it's really holistic core foundations. And when it comes to assessment, yes, PISA includes all of these dimensions. Once again, not as a thematic subject, but embedded in many of the questions, because PISA is developed not as a curriculum assessment, but competency. So regardless of what students learn in school or outside school, PISA is looking at 15-year-old has this competency, and where they learn can be in school or outside of school as well. But of course, just as the citizenship, the assessment as well, we have administering the school and teacher questionnaire, parent questionnaire, and selective and also system level indicators to explore the relationship about the interventions and the student outcomes.
Thanks, Miho. Leanne, would you anything you would like to add just on that?
Yes, the one thing I would like to add is that in our assessment, the Global School-Based Student Health Survey has focused very much on the behaviour, what students do, and well, a little bit on what they know, but really about what they do. And we've found that that's, and Miho is mentioning the sort of outcomes, the impact. So we focus less on like what they know or what they think, because we found that the real impact is, what do you actually do? And so we try and be, because we're trying to capture a whole range of behaviour, we really focus on the behaviour. And then of course we capture the kind of supportive environment and the policies that might do it. But asking students, did they learn this or did they learn that, versus what the actual behaviour is, we want to focus on the behaviour, and GSHS really gets to that as much as possible, because we think those outcomes are of particular importance, and that's what we need to focus on trying to address. So I think it's very complementary.
Great, thanks for that, Leanne. And fully understood that the focus is on the behavioral outcomes that are intended, as much as it is important to be also monitoring efforts to to foster and shape the competencies that would lead to those. One question for all of you. We've just got a few minutes left, so a quick response. Possibly. How have, perhaps if you can each give an example of how results of your surveys, studies have contributed to influence policy or practice towards transformative education. If you could each perhaps give one example, I think that would be useful for the audience to get a sense of where these monitoring efforts and the data that is collected and analyzed, how that actually helps to take us in the direction of transformative education. Whoever would like to come in first. If not, I'll have to call on Miho.
Okay, thank you, Sobhi, for a very good question. And I think the answer is reflected in the methodology we took to co-create this learning compass. So we included not only academic experts and government representatives, but also school leaders, teachers, and even students and teacher educators and non-governmental organizations. And you, Sobhi, you're part of this global community. So we co-created this learning compass together in an iterative process taking 4 years or more. So the result of this is automatic, because everybody has a sense of ownership about this key concept of a learning compass. So everyone in their own corner is taking actions. And just as Leanne said, action matters for the impact. So government people are actually, many countries are in the middle of the cycle of the curriculum redesign. They are immediately taking the knowledge from the learning compass in their curriculum redesign. When teacher educators revising their teacher education programs, teachers immediately in their everyday practices, regardless of what curriculum says or not says, they believe in this the vision of the education and go for education and students themselves as well. It's really the multi-stakeholder actions happening.
Right. No, I appreciate that as much. The process and the inclusion in the process will actually have an influence on those at their different levels. And in the cases you were mentioning, in terms of policy, those responsible for renewal of national school curricula, whether it's on the teacher education or at other levels. Thanks for that. Valeria, perhaps?
Very quickly, I will make a reference to the released book on IEA influence on civic and citizenship education studies, in which we have collected all the impact of the IEA studies on civic and citizenship education in the different countries that took part in the survey, and a reflection on the history and development and the study design across the years. So how you will see that there are several different ways in which our study has impacted the curricula and the school and classroom practices at the country levels.
Excellent, Valeria. That's very good to know, and great if you could share that. And last word to Leanne, perhaps one example.
Well, yes, thank you. It's hard to focus on one example across 112 countries, but I would say I think that understanding the actual behavior of students in some countries has really helped to shape what's taught in school around health. So, for example, in the early days, people just assumed that the focus for like tobacco or alcohol education is about preventing uptake or initiation. And then I think when they started looking at the results of the surveys, they saw so many students are already using tobacco or drinking alcohol, so that the focus on what is taught is also on, for example, quitting or another example with assuming that students aren't sexually active, but discovering that there's quite a lot of early sexual debut. So the focus needs to be on prevention and protection rather than preventing uptake. So I think it's really had an impact in multiple countries to make sure that what is taught to students aligns with their current practice. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot, and thanks to all of you again, Miho, Taguma from OECD, Leanne Riley from the World Health Organization, and Valeria Damiani, related to the International Civic Citizenship Education Study from LUMSA University in Rome. Thank you to the three of you, and thank you also for our colleague Carlos Calderon, who came in on video. There was one last question, but we don't have time for it. It's how do we ensure cultural sensitivity in monitoring and assessment, and move away from the kind of competitive spirit of rankings and classification. Maybe just a quick word from me on that is just to say the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which was just released earlier this month, has as one of its strong messages moving towards pedagogies of cooperation and solidarity. And that really does have implications of what does that mean for what we usually see as individual trajectories based on, competition. A lot of our assessment methods are based on that, selection and competition. So an interesting question to be pursued in a separate discussion. Thank you all again. We have come to the close of this session. There will be a short summary that will be posted later today, and possibility of commenting and adding to that. I think there is now a break of 15 minutes before the start in 15 minutes of 3 concurrent sessions. Thank you all. Thank you, panelists, and thank you to all the participants and all those involved in this session. Thank you.